The history of our planet spans over 4.5 billion years, and for the majority of that time, it has been inhabited by the most diverse living organisms. Earth's biosphere has traversed a long and complex path of survival and development, marked by both periods of explosive growth and catastrophic extinctions. Yet, despite all these trials, life has not vanished from Earth. On the contrary, it has evolved into a separate force capable of changing the planet's very face. Let us embark on a fantastic journey into the past to explore the most significant milestones in our planet's paleontological history and see, with our own eyes, the most unusual creatures that roamed its vast expanses. First, we will travel to the Archaean Eon, the oldest inhabited epoch in Earth's history, to discover who populated our planet during those mysterious times. After that, we'll try to understand how and why life ventured onto the harsh, unwelcoming land, abandoning its cozy, watery cradle. Next, we'll meet the most remarkable creatures from the Age of Dinosaurs and those who rose to replace them. Finally, our journey will conclude by reviewing the most tragic moments in the history of Earth's biosphere, which nearly left our planet a barren wasteland. Get ready. We're about to begin. In reality, for most of its history, Earth looked like a rather inhospitable place. Let's mentally transport ourselves to the Archaean Eon, the most ancient epoch defined by the presence of life. It began 4 billion years ago and lasted for about 1.5 billion years. The young Earth had just survived the second heavy bombardment. Several thousand tons of rocky debris, remnants from the formation of the solar system, rained down on the planet in a crushing hail. And yet, approximately 400 million years later, the first living organisms appeared on it. The Earth of that time had a relatively smooth surface. Tectonic plates, whose collision leads to the formation of high mountain ranges, simply hadn't yet come into existence. The young Earth also couldn't boast a great diversity of rocks. Its composition was primarily formed by basalt, an igneous rock, essentially solidified lava. The Archean atmosphere contained almost no oxygen. Bodies of water in the lowlands. The water in them was acidic, salty, and extremely hot, often reaching boiling temperature. Its composition was largely similar to modern geysers. Paradoxically, this seemingly hostile environment was precisely the setting that became favorable for the emergence and development of primitive life. Naturally, the first organisms were anaerobic. The atmosphere still lacked the oxygen necessary for our familiar respiration, so the first living creatures used other ways to obtain energy. The microorganisms that inhabited Earth during the Archean period could not yet swim. To survive, they needed a substrate, so the biosphere of that era consisted of a thin, no more than 1 millimeter thick, slimy film on the bottom of the coastal zone of the acidic and hot ocean. The maximum depth this zone reached underwater did not exceed 20 meters. The dense atmosphere simply prevented sunlight from penetrating deeper. Life concentrated near the vents of underwater volcanoes, where sulfur and iron compounds were abundant. Over time, the Earth cooled, the ocean level rose, the atmosphere became clearer, and the sun gradually increased in size. The width of the coastal zone accessible to life slowly expanded. By the end of the Archean, life occupied not only a narrow strip along the shores, but also isolated spots in the ocean depths near active volcanoes. However, all the land, rivers, and the vast volume of the open ocean still remained absolutely lifeless. If an explorer were to land on Earth during that period, the only evidence of life noticeable to the naked eye would be stromatolites. These calcareous formations, up to several meters in size, arose from the vital activity of ancient microorganisms. Another problem for the development of life during this period was the scarcity of nutrients. There were no organisms in nature that could decompose dead flesh. Deceased creatures accumulated on the ocean floor under the influence of gravity and ocean currents. Hundreds of millions of years later, these accumulations formed oil deposits. About 3.5 billion years ago, creatures appeared that were destined to change the face of Earth beyond recognition. Some bacteria mastered photosynthesis. Consequence of this process was the Huronian glaciation, the most massive ice age in Earth's history, which began 2.4 billion years ago and lasted for a full 300 million years. According to excavations, glaciers sometimes reached the equator, practically turning the Earth into a snowball. Thus, in 1.5 billion years, our planet traveled a path from boiling lava fields to endless icy deserts. The Proterozoic Eon lasted from 2.5 billion to 540 million years ago. Despite the cold, life continued to evolve. Nevertheless, the land remained absolutely lifeless. Living organisms concentrated in the coastal zone near the equator. But what was happening on the continents? Despite the absence of life on land, interesting events were taking place. The formation of continents, deposits of metallic ores, and layers of rock. During different periods, the appearance of the Earth's terrestrial regions in the Proterozoic changed from an endless glacier to a rocky desert. It is hard to believe, but just 500 million years ago, a significant portion of our planet's surface was difficult to distinguish from a Martian desert. Fortunately for the inhabitants of our planet, the sun gradually became brighter and warmer, and eventually the ice retreated. 542 million years ago, the Phanerozoic Eon, or the time of manifest life, began. It was marked by periods of rapid species development as well as mass extinctions. At the beginning of the Paleozoic Era, most of the land was united into the gigantic supercontinent Gondwana. It was located in the southern hemisphere, had a complex topography, and covered an area of over 100 million square kilometers. It encompassed modern Africa, South America, Antarctica, Australia, the Indian subcontinent, and some other territories. Smaller continents, Laurentia, Baltica, and Siberia, were located in the equatorial zone. There were also many small islands. However, until the Silurian period, all the land remained lifeless. Only the simplest mosses and lichens slowly encroached upon the terrestrial spaces. Only at the beginning of the Silurian did the first plants period is called the Carboniferous. It lasted from 358 to 299 million years ago. By its beginning, a significant part of the tropical belt was covered by tree-like ferns. The dense tropical forests were not continuous. Organisms of that time did not know how to decompose wood, so tall, massive trunks that had lived out their lifespan fell to the ground. They remained lying, storing the phosphorus vital for plants. Lush thickets alternated with multi-kilometer piles of dead trunks. Subsequently, they turned into the coal deposits that still hold immense industrial significance. Only fungi, mosses, and lichens lived on the land. They couldn't stabilize the topsoil with roots, so rains washed it away, turning rivers into muddy torrents and lakes into rotting swamps. Arid regions, on the other hand, became lifeless deserts. In the seas and rivers, fish flourished, but life did not conquer the open ocean. Algae had not yet learned to float freely in the water column, meaning animals also remained confined to the coastal zone. The Carboniferous period was succeeded by the Permian, which began 299 and ended 250 million years ago. During this time, The first amphibians emerged onto land, and plants began to conquer the subtropics. The sea remained populated primarily in the shallow waters along the shores. The Permian period ended with the most massive extinction event in the history of multicellular life. By some estimates, up to 96% of marine life and up to 73% of terrestrial life perished. The reasons for such a colossal loss of life are still unknown. However, the subsequent Triassic period of the Mesozoic era quickly compensated for the losses and, moreover, elevated life to a new level. For the first time in Earth's history, temperate latitudes were covered with forests. A revolution also occurred in the sea. Cyanobacteria, close to modern blue-green algae, appeared. They no longer required a substrate, and the photosynthetic microorganisms rapidly colonized the upper layer of the world ocean. Following the food source is now. Territories near the equator, conversely, became arid. Despite the widespread distribution of forests, Earth still had its share of both swamps and deserts. Moreover, the deserts were not only hot and dry, as we usually imagine them, but also temperate, cool, and even wet. Without a plant cover, the soil could not hold on to rocky slopes, and only lichens can grow on bare rocks. Flowering plants became widespread in the middle of the Cretaceous period, about 100 million years ago. Initially, these were trees, and only toward the end of the period did plants similar to modern grasses appear. Compared to a mighty oak or a giant sequoia, simple grass seems insignificant. But it can do what the giants cannot. The intertwining of small roots forms a strong sod. It not only stabilizes the soil, preventing its erosion, but also helps retain moisture when it is abundant and accumulate it when scarce. The emergence of herbaceous plants transformed deserts into steppes and savannas, swamps into flood meadows, and areas of permafrost into tundra and tundra steppes. By the end of the Cretaceous period, the Earth already resembled the modern world. Only one small detail was missing: mammals. This class of animals had existed for a long time, but throughout the Mesozoic era, it did not achieve widespread distribution. It is still not definitively known what caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. A giant meteorite, global cooling, and other reasons are cited as culprits. In any case, the giant reptiles disappeared, making way for mammals. Over 66 million years, they transformed from small, marsupial-like creatures into majestic whales, resilient camels, or agile bats. Ultimately, evolution led to the emergence of a unique species, the only living creature that does not adapt to nature but changes it. A creature that extracts coal formed from trees that died millions of years ago to heat its dwelling. A creature that exterminates other species for sport and caprice. A creature that, in pursuit of its goals, turns vast areas into uninhabitable regions. This is Homo sapiens, or wise man. Life on our planet originated in the water. This is Martian landscapes. The Ediacaran period, the last of the Proterozoic, began approximately 635 million years ago and lasted 94 million years. The Earth of that time was not the most welcoming place. A modern human, transported to the conditions of this epoch, would quickly lose consciousness due to suffocation. The oxygen concentration was half of what it is today. The landscapes of the Ediacaran period were endless deserts and rocky mountains, lacking the slightest hint of life. At the same time, the coastal strip of the ocean was relatively densely populated by extremely unusual creatures, completely unlike any living species today. These were mainly benthic organisms that led a stationary lifestyle and fed on nutrient particles floating in the water. These organisms presumably had no muscles, developed nervous system, or hard shell. All these adaptations were simply unnecessary for survival, as predators virtually did not exist yet. They appeared only at the very end of the Ediacaran period and immediately took a dominant position in the ancient ocean. Active hunting proved to be a highly effective survival strategy, as the stationary, soft-bodied benthic inhabitants could neither flee from an enemy, fight back, nor even hide. For the first predators, the ocean was like an endless feast, or all-you-can-eat buffet, full of nourishing and easily obtainable food. It's no surprise that most of the ancient creatures that inhabited it quickly went extinct. Only a few beings managed to change to withstand the new threats. Approximately 542 million years ago, a period began that greatly influenced the face of our planet. The geological layers of this epoch are filled with numerous fossils of highly organized living creatures. Such findings suggest that at this time, the ancient ocean was abundantly populated by creatures possessing an impressive exoskeleton, a shell or carapace. This process is called the Cambrian explosion, and it became the most important milestone in the history of life's development on our planet, marking the beginning of the Phanerozoic, or the era of visible life. The first period of the Phanerozoic Eon is called the Cambrian. It began 500 many entirely new forms of life organization. Some of them proved to be dead ends and died out, while others gave rise to a huge diversity of new species. For example, about 550 to 530 million years ago, tiny benthic creatures called Haikuella, similar to mollusks, developed a hard, cartilaginous tube running the length of their body. These creatures are considered some of the oldest ancestors of modern vertebrates. A little later lived Pikaia, small creatures resembling lancelets, flatworms, or primitive fish in appearance. A sturdy and flexible motochord, combined with muscles attached to it, allowed them to swim in the water, flexing their whole body. This mode of locomotion proved to be extremely effective and fast, enabling early chordates to survive and subsequently evolve into more highly organized species. All paleontological finds from the Cambrian period belong to marine inhabitants, as the absolute majority of creatures of that time lived in the ocean. Many creatures imprinted in the rocks look completely unfamiliar and even gruesome to us. For example, Anomalocaris, a giant shrimp up to 60 centimeters long, which was one of the main predators of the Cambrian. However, other finds look completely unremarkable, yet they testify to extremely important phenomena. These include the oldest discovered fossils of terrestrial soils. Their age is about 530 million years, corresponding to the Middle and Late Cambrian. Without specialized knowledge, it is difficult to notice anything special in these inconspicuous-looking stones. However, the existence of such imprints means that roughly around this time, the surface of the land had begun to be colonized by the first primitive algae and microorganisms. By growing, dying, and decomposing, they formed a nourishing substrate for their descendants. Most likely, the first colonies of microorganisms on land formed in moist and warm places, such as shallow waters or the ocean's tidal zone. The abundance of water and light, as well as the absence of creatures that could eat the young algae, allowed them to multiply quickly and successfully adapt subsequently. This feature would become an important factor in the adaptation to land. Additionally, jawless fish, similar to modern lampreys, developed, and a little later, cartilaginous fish. Meanwhile, plants on land spread further and further away from the water. The first multicellular plants, clearly adapted to life on land, appeared. They left behind imprints of spores and vascular tissues, which served to deliver moisture to the upper parts of the plant. However, animal life was still wary of leaving its familiar habitat, though it is possible that some crustaceans had the opportunity to briefly explore the coastal zones. This period ended with the Ordovician-Silurian extinction, the causes of which remain a mystery. The most popular theory suggests global cooling and the subsequent drop in the world ocean level. Be that as it may, as a result of the mass extinction, up to 50% of all species vanished from the face of the planet. Nevertheless, life managed to adapt to the new conditions and even reached a qualitatively new level. The next period, called the Silurian, is located on the timeline between 444 and 419 million years ago. Huge arthropods dominated the oceans of that time. It was during this period that the giant sea scorpion lived, reaching a length of almost 3 meters. Furthermore, fish developed rapidly, including large and fast predators over a meter long. It is not surprising that some creatures preferred to leave the ocean and attempt to conquer new living spaces. It was at this time that the first arthropods emerged onto land. These were ancient sea scorpions and other crustaceans. They had a chitinous shell, which protected against desiccation and preserved the body shape, as well as small legs that allowed them to move on the hard surface outside the sea. It is reasonable to assume that the first arthropods to move onto land tried not to stray far from the water. Their respiratory organs had to remain moist to perform their function. However, the arthropods were attracted by the abundance of plant food outside the sea. Another factor was safety, as predators had not yet learned to follow their victims beyond the aquatic element. Gradually, the conquerors of the land adapted to the new conditions and permanently transitioned to a terrestrial lifestyle, eventually Rhiniophytes, nor the later mosses and lichens, had a normal root system. Instead of branched roots that firmly held the plant in the soil, they had, at best, primitive rhizomes. Therefore, the soil was quickly washed into rivers by precipitation, turning them into muddy torrents and deltas into swamps. In these moist places, rich in organic matter, vegetation flourished, providing food for the insects and other inhabitants of Earth at that time. The abundance of insects and their larvae, in turn, attracted fish to the swamps. However, the large amount of decaying organic matter absorbed oxygen from the swamp water, making it difficult for aquatic inhabitants to breathe. Therefore, fish living in such areas adapted by swallowing atmospheric air to compensate for the oxygen deficit. Gradually, a lung-like sac developed in them, allowing them to remain outside the water body for a considerable time. In parallel, another important adaptation was forming. The thick stems of plants growing densely in the swampy area provided fish with shelter from larger predators. However, navigating through them was difficult. For this, slender fins were insufficient. Powerful and fleshy limbs were needed. Therefore, the fins of swamp fish lengthened and acquired additional bones, serving as a foundation for strong muscles. Thus, the first bony-finned lungfish, lobe-finned fish, appeared, a typical representative of which could be Eusthenopteron. This fish with powerful fins did not yet aspire to land, but already knew how to breathe atmospheric oxygen and spend some time out of the water. Small, swampy water bodies often dried up, and the ability to crawl over land to other, wetter and more favorable places became a huge advantage. For example, this is what Acanthostega did, living about 365 million years ago, at the end of the Devonian period. Being a transitional form between fish and amphibians, Acanthostega had gills, scales, and a caudal fin exactly like other fish. At the same time, this amazing creature had 4 limbs and the lung-like sac, allowing it to breathe atmospheric air like amphibians. Unfortunately, Acanthostega's limbs were too weak to support its weight on land, and its primitive ribcage structure did not allow. Its ear bone clearly indicates that Tiktaalik, could distinguish sounds well both in water and on land. All these signs clearly indicate that this creature spent no less time on land than in the water. During the Carboniferous period that followed the Devonian, amphibians finally conquered the land, firmly establishing themselves in diverse ecological niches. In the process of evolutionary struggle, they gave rise to animal classes like reptiles and synapsids. The diversity of conditions outside the ocean significantly stimulated and accelerated the process of evolution, since terrestrial inhabitants are subjected to a much wider range of temperatures and other conditions than aquatic ones. However, a question might arise. Why did the move onto land happen only once in the entire history of evolution? Why hasn't a single aquatic species left the ocean for solid ground in the last 350 million years? The answer isn't as complex as it may seem. Organisms living in the sea possess adaptations that are beneficial precisely in the aquatic environment. The vast majority of these are useless and even harmful on land. Life in a different medium requires a completely different structure of the skeleton, external coverings, as well as organs for vision and hearing. A fish thrown onto land is even more helpless than a human adrift in the open sea. It would obviously quickly become easy prey for terrestrial creatures. Plants, arthropods, and vertebrates, when they ventured onto land in the Paleozoic era, were colonizing unoccupied ecological niches. In the new environment, they had no natural enemies, yet there was an abundance of food. The main negative factor when moving onto land was not other creatures, but the new environmental conditions, and the species had time to calmly adapt to them. However, we all know an example of the reverse process. The ancient ancestors of cetaceans, whales and dolphins, readapted to the aquatic environment, establishing dominance in certain ecological niches. This might seem strange, but there is actually no contradiction. The fact is that the terrestrial environment places much harsher and more diverse demands on its inhabitants. Therefore, in some cases, returning to the ocean can be advantageous for survival. Whales, dolphins, and other secondarily aquatic inhabitants of oceans, seas, and rivers are excellent proof that evolution is not a linear. The isolation of animal and plant populations and spurred the development of new evolutionary adaptations. In terms of climate, the Mesozoic was, on average, the warmest era in the entire history of multicellular life. Throughout its duration, even the polar regions lacked a stable ice cover. Nevertheless, the temperature periodically dropped, forcing the animal and plant world to adapt to new conditions. The Mesozoic era is divided into 3 periods, the first of which is called the Triassic. It began about 252 million years ago and lasted approximately 51 million years. During this time, deep processes within the Earth's interior only began to break Pangaea apart, so the supercontinent remained largely intact throughout the period. The Ural Mountains, one of the oldest mountain ranges preserved to this day, completed their formation in the Triassic. At that time, these were young and tall mountains. The climate of this period was relatively dry and hot, leading to the formation of many deserts and a reduction in the area of inland water bodies. For most of the Triassic, the oxygen content in the air was about 10%. However, approximately 215 million years ago, its level abruptly jumped to 19%. The reason for this phenomenon is not definitively known, but it may be related to the evolution and spread of certain species of aquatic or terrestrial plants. The overwhelming majority of plant mass at that time consisted of ancient seed ferns, but they were gradually being displaced by more advanced groups. For example, these included cycads, ginkgos, and ancient conifers. Many of these orders have survived to this day, but have significantly reduced their diversity. Meanwhile, marine life followed its own path of development. Oceans emptied after the Permian catastrophe were gradually repopulated by turtles and bony fish. And the niche of large predators was occupied by the first representatives of the order ichthyosaurs. They would later become the most adapted reptiles to the aquatic environment. But in the Triassic, these animals were still quite primitive. An example is Symbospondylus groups. By the middle of the period, the first dinosaurs differentiated from ancient archosaurs. However, a long and hard struggle for survival awaited them. Only toward the end of the Triassic, after a sharp increase in size that coincided with the rise in atmospheric oxygen concentration, did dinosaurs begin, step by step, to assert their dominance in Earth's biosphere. The images of the terrifying reptiles are familiar to almost every modern person. Dozens of films have been made and thousands of books written about them. Yet, against this backdrop, equally important and interesting animals of this period are often overlooked. For example, the small creature Oligokyphus, which lived in the late Triassic, approximately 200 million years ago. This small and quick creature belongs to the cynodonts, ancient animals that differed from mammals by only a few subtle features. Oligokyphus, like many cynodonts, resembled a weasel in appearance. It was a herbivorous, warm-blooded animal widely distributed across modern North America, as well as Europe and China. Although it is not definitively known whether Oligokyphus had a pouch on its abdomen, the structure of its skeleton suggests that its young were extremely small, characteristic of modern marsupials. In addition, there is a high probability that these animals fed their offspring milk. Scientists believe that Oligokyphus dug burrows and built nests in them, which may indicate a comparatively high level of intelligence. Unfortunately, these creatures died out at the beginning of the Jurassic period, presumably due to a reduction in their food supply. Nevertheless, they remain the most ancient animals maximally similar to modern mammals. The end of the Triassic period was marked by the Triassic-Jurassic Extinction Event. Many species of amphibians and a portion of the archosaurs vanished from the face of the Earth. Volcanic activity, falling ocean levels, and rapid climate change are considered the causes of this event. In any case, this extinction freed up many ecological niches, allowing dinosaurs to further solidify their position on the Earth's evolutionary stage. The next period of the Mesozoic Era is called the Jurassic. It began approximately 201 million years ago and ended about 145 million years ago, thus lasting about 56 million years. This was a time of large-scale tectonic shifts and the period. Earth's climate was hot and humid, but toward its end, a relatively short cooling period was observed. Huge expanses of land were covered by tropical forests, consisting mainly of cycads, which externally resembled palms. In addition, coniferous trees resembling modern cypresses and pines were widespread. On land, the Age of Dinosaurs began to flourish. They exhibited incredible diversity and occupied most ecological niches, dominating virtually every one. Among them, one could find both small reptiles the size of a cat and true giants. Sauropods, herbivorous dinosaurs that looked similar to each other, including Brachiosaurus, Brontosaurus, and Diplodocus, as well as other groups, became widespread in the Jurassic period. The largest of them, the Titanosaurs, reached 35 to 40 meters in length. Their mass ranged from 80 to 100 tons. An unusual feature of sauropods was the so-called sacral brain, an enlargement in the posterior part of the spine, which hypothetically could contain 20 times more nervous tissue than the brain. It is currently believed that the sacral cavity was most likely filled with a glycogen body and served as a source of additional nutrition for the giant reptile's nervous system. In parallel, other groups of animals continued to develop, such as mammals and reptiles, as well as arthropods. In the oceans during this period, bivalve mollusks, similar to modern ones, became widespread, and the dominant predators were various aquatic reptiles, ichthyosaurs and pliosaurs. If we compare Ophthalmosaurus, which lived in the mid to late Jurassic period, with its Triassic ancestor, Symbospondylus, It is hard to believe that these animals are related. The ancestor swam by undulating its entire body, while the descendant was propelled by a powerful vertical tail, well adapted to the aquatic environment. This aquatic reptile had a dolphin-like body with a graceful and powerful crescent-shaped vertical tail. It is assumed that it breathed atmospheric air, while it could spend about 20 minutes underwater, reach speeds of over 7 kilometers per hour, and dive to depths of about 600 meters. The structure of Ophthalmosaurus's teeth suggests that its main food source was America also broke off and moved westward. Consequently, by the end of the period, the outlines of Africa, Australia, and Greenland, as well as North and South America, resembled modern ones, while Europe and Asia were just beginning to establish their boundaries. The climate of the Cretaceous period was comparatively cool. The average temperature slightly increased between 185 million years ago, and then cooling began again, which lasted until the end of the era. This was the time when Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops lived, the most famous dinosaurs and true symbols of the Mesozoic. However, much more important is the fact that it was during the Cretaceous period that flowering plants, angiosperms, became widespread, first trees and then grasses. By forming sod, they stabilized the soil layer and made it more fertile, and their nutritious seeds became a food source for many species. This served as an evolutionary catalyst for the increasing diversity of mammals and, to a lesser extent, some herbivorous dinosaurs. Therefore, despite the total dominance of reptiles in all ecological niches, mammals continued to develop. Their diversity gradually grew, and by the end of the period, separate groups could be distinguished, such as ungulates, insectivores, carnivores, and primates. One of the largest mammals of the Cretaceous was Repenomamus, which lived approximately 125 million years ago. Its body length reached 1 meter, and its weight was between 12 and 14 kilograms. Externally, this creature presumably resembled a modern Tasmanian devil. Judging by the structure of its teeth, Repenomamus was a predator, but its limbs were short and clumsy, so it most likely hunted from ambush. Not long ago, a skeleton of Repenomamus was found with the remains of a small dinosaur in its stomach area. This finding may serve as evidence that some mammals of this period could prey on small dinosaur species. Meanwhile, in the seas, large swimming reptiles dominated for a long time: ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and pliosaurs. But in the middle of the Cretaceous period, their numbers significantly decreased as a result of the so-called Cenomanian-Turonian extinction event, linked to a sharp drop in oxygen content. Tyrannosaurus. Such a reduction in size is presumed to have been associated with a food deficit. Forced to survive in the harsh conditions of the far north, among the snowfields, under the cover of the polar night, this dinosaur acquired a number of unusual adaptations. Firstly, it was likely warm-blooded, with a rather high metabolic rate, similar to modern birds. Secondly, Nanooksaurus had a multi-layered downy coat, allowing it to retain heat in the cruel northern frosts. It follows that this northern reptile was most likely an active and fast predator. However, traditional methods of tracking prey are not as effective during the polar night, so Nanooksaurus likely had a well-developed sense of smell and sensitive night vision. These assumptions are supported by the structural features of its skull. Summer in the northern latitudes was short and cool, so the eggs required an additional influx of heat for the normal development of the young. It is presumed that Nanooksaurus, like other northern dinosaurs, incubated their clutches and showed parental care. Studies of the found remains show that this species had a comparatively large brain volume, meaning it was potentially no less intelligent than most modern birds. Unfortunately, all these adaptations did not save Nanooksaurus from extinction. Approximately 66 million years ago, The Cretaceous Paleogene Extinction Event wiped out all non-avian dinosaurs, marine reptiles, and pterosaurs, as well as many other creatures, from the face of the Earth. Nevertheless, the terrifying reptiles left their significant mark on the history of our planet. The ecological niches they vacated were quickly occupied by birds and mammals, giving rise to a new era, the Cenozoic. Its supreme creation was the unique being called Homo sapiens, who arbitrarily declared himself king of nature. Its path continues, and only time will tell where it will lead. As a result of the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, 3/4 of all living organisms on Earth ceased to exist. Almost all animals larger than 25 kilograms died, including virtually all non-flying dinosaurs. This tragic event marked the end of the Mesozoic and the beginning of the Cenozoic, the geological era that continues to this day. Recognize the outlines of modern continents, but they were positioned slightly differently. South and North America were separated by tropical seas, and the Indian subcontinent had not yet collided with Asia. The ancient Tethys Ocean still divided Africa and Eurasia, but was rapidly shrinking due to the movement of tectonic plates. The climate of this epoch was more uniform and warmer than modern times. A significant part of our planet was covered by dense and lush tropical forests. The absolute majority of animals of that time were small in size, but they were actively developing, colonizing more and more new territories. It was then that the oldest ancestors of most modern mammals appeared. For example, the warm forests of the Paleocene were inhabited by miacids, small agile predators resembling martens. They are considered to be the progenitors of the entire order of modern carnivorous mammals. The ancestors of cetaceans also appeared around this time. At that point, they looked more like hippos. They had not yet fully transitioned to an aquatic lifestyle, but had already taken the first step toward it. Their limbs, respiratory organs, and inner ear had begun to adapt to long underwater dives. The next epoch in our planet's history was the Eocene. It began approximately 56 million years ago and lasted a little over 22 million years. By this time, the outlines of the continents had already approached modern ones. India finally reached the southern shores of Asia, and the collision of tectonic plates began to crumple the layers of rock into gigantic folds. Thus, the Himalayas, the largest mountain system on our planet today, were formed. Although some animals of that time already resembled modern species in appearance, others differed significantly from them. Such was, for example, Andrewsarchus, one of the largest predatory mammals ever to walk the surface of the Earth. The length of its skull reached 84 centimeters, about 1.5 times that of a brown bear, and its bite, according to calculations, was stronger than that of any modern terrestrial predator. This is evidenced by the deep grooves in the Andrewsarchus skull, which served as attachment points for the jaw muscles. The size of this animal suggests that the total body length of Andrewsarchus could exceed 4 meters, and its mass could reach a whole ton 9/10 million years ago, and ended about 23 million years ago. During this time, the Earth's climate became noticeably colder and drier. Lush tropical forests were gradually replaced by endless steppes, overgrown with herbaceous grasses. It was then that Antarctica began to be covered by an ice sheet, transforming from a green continent into a lifelessly cold desert. Australia continued to drift away from other continents, and Africa advanced north, converging with Europe. The collision of tectonic plates caused the rapid growth of mountain chains. Thus, the Alps were born. Approximately 26 to 28 million years ago, the La Garita supervolcano erupted in modern Colorado, becoming one of the largest volcanic emissions throughout the entire Phanerozoic Eon. an area of 30,000 square kilometers was covered by a layer of hot ash about 100 meters thick. All life in a huge radius around the volcano was completely destroyed. However, life is capable of overcoming any catastrophe. The expanses of the Earth at that time were inhabited by amazing animals, some of which were no less in size than dinosaurs. Such were the Indricotheres, giant hornless rhinos. The largest of them, Paraceratherium, reached a height of 4 8/10 meters at the shoulder. This is larger than a big African elephant. And thanks to their long neck, these giants could raise their heads up to 7 meters high. A modern rhinoceros could walk under its gigantic ancestor's belly, and a human could barely reach its knee. The mass of these giants reached 20 tons. This makes them the largest terrestrial mammals of all time. Even Brontosaurus, the most massive of the terrestrial dinosaurs, weighed only about 15 tons. The details of the Indricotheres' appearance are still unknown. Unfortunately, to date, not a single complete skeleton of these amazing animals has been found. Only separate fragments belonging to different individuals. Most scientists agree that despite their kinship with rhinos, Indricotheres did not have a massive horn, but they might have possessed a small proboscis, like modern tapirs. Predators, antilodonts, were abundant on Earth. The remains of these creatures have been found widely across Eurasia and North America. Being odd-toed ungulates, antilodonts are not the ancestors of modern pigs. Evolutionarily, these creatures are closer to hippos or even cetaceans. These animals reached 2 meters in height and weighed up to a ton. Their meter-long head had an enormous mouth, studded with a rich array of teeth, sharp incisors and long canines, as well as wide, flat molars. Most likely, antilodonts were omnivorous creatures with a tendency toward carnivory. Despite their size, they could develop quite high speeds when necessary, so escaping from such a monster was not easy. A wild boar the size of a large bull, preferring to eat meat, posed a serious threat to any inhabitant of Earth at that time. Therefore, it is not surprising that antilodonts were the dominant predators of their epoch. The next period, the Pliocene, began 5 million years ago and ended only 2,580,000 years ago. In this time span, our planet acquired an appearance virtually indistinguishable from the present. The continents took their modern positions on the planet's surface, and most animals and plants became similar to the species we are familiar with. The Earth's climate gradually became increasingly arid and cold. The polar ice caps gradually grew, and the end of the period was marked by global glaciation. At this time, our planet was inhabited by many amazing creatures. In the depths of the ocean waters, the megalodon, a giant shark reaching 15 meters in length and weighing up to 35 tons, instilled terror in marine inhabitants. On land, one could encounter various gomphotheres, ancient relatives of modern elephants. A distinctive feature of many of them was 4 powerful tusks, and their size could both exceed the dimensions of a modern African elephant or be quite small. Around 2.5 million years ago, the Quaternary period, Anthropogene, began, the last geological period in Earth's history to date. It was marked by the emergence and development of Homo sapiens, as well as its ancient ancestors. For example, the Gigantopithecus, one of their kinship with orangutans, scientists believe that they most likely moved on all 4 limbs. These hominids also had a relatively large brain volume, meaning they might have possessed a comparatively high intelligence, and perhaps were even capable of creating primitive tools. Unfortunately, the population of these imagination-stretching giants sharply declined with the spread of the ancient ancestors of modern humans across the Earth. and they finally became extinct approximately 1 to 300,000 years ago. Additionally, too few Gigantopithecus remains have been found, which greatly hinders their study. Spreading across the Earth, primitive human tribes destroyed quite a few other creatures. Other giants presumed to have disappeared from the face of the Earth due to human fault were diprotodons, which inhabited Australia between 1 and 6/10 million and approximately 40,000 years ago. These were the largest known marsupials, related to wombats and koalas. Some individuals of these amazing creatures reached 3 meters in length and 2 meters at the shoulder, and their mass was about 3 tons. Thus, diprotodons were comparable in size to some hippos. These were massive herbivorous creatures inhabiting the woodlands and coastal grassy plains, which were abundant in Australia before the arrival of humans. The disappearance of the marsupial giants coincides with the human settlement of the continent. However, some scientists suggest that the main reason for their extinction might have been not hunting, but a magnetic field anomaly of the Earth, which coincided with a local temperature decrease. The increased radiation background, coupled with the cooling, slowed plant growth, causing famine among the herbivores, and the encounter with humans merely finished off the weakened population. The last epoch, the Holocene, was marked by the rapid development of human civilization, as a result of which Homo sapiens spread across the Earth and established a dominant position among the other inhabitants of our planet. The flip side of this development has been numerous man-made disasters and irreversible changes in biological balance. For example, the area of forests has been reduced by 1/3 over the last 10,000 years. This process accelerates every year, which can lead to progress. And will nature create radically new forms of life after overcoming this crisis, as has happened before? Hardly anyone can answer these questions. The development of life on Earth was not linear. There were periods of greater diversity and periods of near total extinction. Such conclusions follow from the analysis of fossils and geological deposits found during paleontological excavations. Over the last 500 million years, 5 major extinctions and about 20 less significant ones have occurred. However, the most global crisis of the biosphere on our planet occurred much earlier, approximately 2,100,000,000 years ago. It is believed that the first living organisms on Earth appeared quite early, about 4 billion years ago. That is, approximately 400 million years after the planet's surface became relatively habitable. The Earth of that time hardly looked welcoming. Bare rocks, dense clouds, frequent thunderstorms and earthquakes, and an oxygen-free atmosphere consisting mainly of nitrogen, methane, and carbon dioxide. This was the epoch of primitive microorganisms, archaea and bacteria, the vast majority of which used photosynthesis that did not produce oxygen. Furthermore, it is hypothesized that many intermediate forms existed that cannot be unambiguously classified as living or non-living objects. Approximately 2,700,000,000 years ago, the oxygenic photosynthesis familiar to us emerged, a form of photosynthesis that releases oxygen. It is still used by the overwhelming majority of plants and single-celled algae. Anaerobic organisms cannot survive with a significant oxygen content in the environment, so ancient algae, by releasing oxygen through their life processes, killed off competitors and cleared living space for themselves. Initially, the oxygen was consumed by the oxidation of rocks in the habitats of aerobic organism colonies. This formed oxygen pockets, small areas with oxidized minerals. Gradually, oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere, oxidizing sulfur and iron compounds dissolved in the water. Anaerobic organisms, unable to survive in an oxygen-saturated environment, died out, surviving only in oxygen-deprived subterranean pockets. The biosphere, as it were, turned inside out. This was a time of extremely slow evolution for single-celled microorganisms, which was complicated by prolonged mass glaciations. This entire process was named the Great Oxidation Event, or the oxygen catastrophe. It was not fast, but it was certainly extremely massive and all-consuming. Virtually all the diversity of the oxygen-free period developed by the biosphere was destroyed, and evolution slowed down for a good billion years due to global cooling. And all this was for the sake of transitioning life to a more energy-efficient type of metabolism. Approximately 540 million years ago, the Phanerozoic Eon began, the Age of Visible Life, as it is sometimes called. It was marked by the explosive development of multicellular organisms and continues to this day. Many creatures of that period looked utterly fantastical and resembled none of the modern species. However, about 450 million years ago, the rapid development of life was abruptly interrupted by an unknown factor. Possible causes include a cosmic gamma-ray burst, volcanic activity, or even the impact of a large celestial body. Be that as it may, over 7 million years, 40 to 50% of all living creatures died out. This event, named the Ordovician-Silurian extinction, severely impacted trilobites, mollusks, and some other marine invertebrates of that period. The late Paleozoic, which followed this extinction, was marked by the explosive development of terrestrial vegetation. The first amphibians and reptiles also appeared at this time. Fish actively developed, beginning to dominate all freshwater and saltwater bodies. About 372 million years ago, the so-called Late Devonian extinction began. It occurred in several phases, interspersed with recovery periods. But overall, for 25 million years, the rate of species extinction was higher than average. The most likely cause of this extinction is considered to be the following. Terrestrial plants of that period grew powerful and long with the increased oxygen content in the atmosphere. At that time, its concentration reached 35%. The Great Permian extinction occurred approximately 251 to 253 million years ago, at the boundary of the Permian and Triassic periods. It was the most massive and global event in the entire history of multicellular life. Paleontological excavations show that it resulted in the disappearance of up to 95% of marine species and up to 70% of terrestrial species from the face of the Earth. Moreover, this catastrophe happened almost instantaneously by geological standards, within a maximum of 200,000 years. The recovery of biological diversity took at least 50 million years for terrestrial life, and about 100 million for marine life. The famous trilobites, many marine invertebrates, and microorganisms almost completely vanished. Insects also became significantly smaller. Instead of gigantic creatures, as if from a horror film, they became similar to modern, small, and numerous beings. The causes of the Great Permian extinction are still not entirely clear. Possible reasons include active volcanic activity as the most likely hypothesis, as well as a collision with a large celestial body, climate change, and sudden strong methane emissions as a result of biological or tectonic activity. A definitive answer to this question is currently impossible. The Triassic period that followed the Great Permian extinction was marked by the explosive development of vertebrate life. It was during this period that archosaurs appeared, ancient reptiles that gave rise to crocodiles and dinosaurs. The first mammals also appeared in the Triassic, although they were not widespread during this period. About 200 million years ago, the Triassic-Jurassic extinction began. It lasted about 10,000 years and marked the boundary between the Triassic and Jurassic periods. About half of the known species living on Earth at that time fell victim to this extinction. Among them were various reptiles and amphibians, whose disappearance freed up ecological niches and allowed dinosaurs to dominate the planet for the next 130 million years. The causes of the Triassic extinction are unknown. None of the hypotheses currently proposed are sufficiently convincing. The Jurassic and Cretaceous periods that followed 66 million years ago. This was the most famous and quite large mass extinction, called the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction. The first and most popular theory explaining this extinction was the hypothesis of a giant celestial body impact. Everyone knows about the meteorite that destroyed the dinosaurs. However, its actual role is still unknown. In any case, this event resulted in the extinction of all non-avian dinosaurs, as well as many conifers, algae, and mollusks. The Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction became the boundary between the Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras, marking the beginning of a new geological era, the Cenozoic, which continues to this day. During the Cenozoic era, mammals rapidly developed and spread across the planet, as did birds and flowering plants. Mammals colonized virtually every corner of the Earth, from tropical forests to the icy caps of the poles, from the depths of the ocean and the Earth's interior to the air currents. Ultimately, evolution led to the appearance of humans. Of course, even in our enlightened age, there are people who do not believe in evolution. However, the theory of evolution does not require belief. It is a scientific theory based on facts. The modern theory of species change has undergone a long development and differs significantly from the theory proposed by Charles Darwin 161 years ago. Nevertheless, the general principles of this scientific theory remain the same, and at present, the theory of evolution is the only serious scientific theory that reliably describes the process of change and the emergence of species of living beings. Some scientists believe that you and I are living in the era of the sixth mass extinction, which is called the Holocene, Anthropocene, or Quaternary extinction. Over the last 10,000 years, thousands of species have died out. In the last 500 years, about 900 species of large animals have vanished from the face of the Earth. Currently, 40% of amphibian species and 25% of mammal species are threatened with extinction. And most likely, one of the main causes is human activity. Will humanity cope with this threat? Will life transition to a new important discoveries await us?